Okay, well, we're going to move on to... We lost our next speaker in the middle of the crowd. Some apologies to you. We're going to now move on to our second session, and that is with Dr. Richard Goy, ceremonial architecture in the Doge's palace. Now, Dr. Goy is a practicing architect and an architectural historian. He's the author of Chioggia and the Villages of the Venetian Lagoons and Venetian vernacular architecture. And the book that he has just published is called The House of Gold, and it's a history of the Cardoro in Venice. Richard Goy.
Thank you.
Close the window for a while.
Thank you. As you see, I'm going to talk about ceremonial architecture at the Palazzo Ducale, which is a pretty daunting subject if you take it as a whole. So to give myself a bit of a chance, I'm going to narrow things down somewhat and to confine myself to, firstly, to the medieval fabric of the Palazzo Ducale, its construction broadly up to the completion of the east wing by Rizzo and Lombardo, with a footnote on Sansovino for reasons that I think will become apparent. My second caveat, if you like, or qualification, is that I'd like to talk about ceremonial in a rather less direct way than perhaps you might expect, taking the term to embrace matters such as iconography and certain symbolic aspects of some features of the palace's construction over this period. Ceremonial, of course, embraced many aspects of the way in which the palace was used, and ceremonial, of course, itself is suffused with metaphor and symbolism, none more so than the coronation of a new Doge, with which my little discussion will be concluded. I hope, therefore, to try and show some of the ways in which the Palazzo was built, or rather rebuilt, as a vehicle to express in its planning and organizational structure certain symbolic aspects of the government of the Republic. One of the features that will emerge very clearly is the slow, rather painfully evolutionary nature of this reconstruction, the accumulation of symbolism in stages, and in particular, as I will come to a little later on, the almost painfully slow development of the only one true formal spatial axis that there is in the whole complex, and that will form the latter part of what I'd like to talk about. The definitive reconstruction, as you may know, began in around 1340 and really continued until the early part of the 16th century. It took place very broadly in a clockwise manner, beginning with the southern wing, the wing that faces the bacino, followed by the Piazzetta wing, the Porta Delicata, the group which I shall call the Foscari complex for ease of shorthand, and finally the east wing and the Scala dei Giganti. But as I said, this was by no means the orderly, planned operation that one might think, and in fact was to a large extent an opportunistic process, shall we say. To appreciate a little more fully, I think, some of these, the symbolic aspects of this long reconstruction, I think we have to go back a stage to the status quo ante, as it were, the arrangement of the complex immediately prior to the vital decision of 1340. This original construction, as you may well know, contained three basic elements and reached their really definitive form under Doge Ziani in the 1170s. At the risk of some oversimplification, we may summarize by stating that that one major component of the government of the Republic was housed in each of the three buildings forming the three sides of the rectangle, the fourth side, of course, being San Marco itself. The ducal apartments were housed in the east wing towards its northern end. in this corner over here. This is the present arrangement, but the earlier arrangement was very similar. The Palazzo, containing various other elements of the government, including the first hall of the Maggior Consiglio, was in the Molo wing over on the far side, while that on the Piazzetta housed the Palace of Justice. The importance of this tripartite division, of course, is that in principle it was retained in the long process of reconstruction. And I think it's of some value to note why this form came into being and why this arrangement came into being. And not only that, it was retained in the reconstruction, in the long reconstruction of 1340, and even again after the two disastrous fires in 1574 and 77, the basic principles of the arrangement were retained. Here I think we see a splendid example of the practical exigency of and conservative and mixed with symbolism that is so highly characteristic of Venetian government through the ages. The role of the Doge, of course, is pivotal. We have to start with him, and his location in the plan is of great importance. His apartments were located in that very discreet block, almost tacked on to the apse of San Marco, and further south was the block containing various other magistracies of the Republic. The location befitted the nominal modesty of his title in some ways. Although he was a serene prince, of course, in another sense he was primus inter pares, with many and increasingly severe restrictions on his practical power and his physical freedom. But the location, of course, provided practical security from the outside world. It was the most difficult part of the whole complex to physically get to, and therefore security was and remained a fairly important consideration. The physical attachment to San Marco was equally vital and equally obviously vital, I think, for practical and again for deeply symbolic reasons. San Marco, of course, as Deborah said, was the private chapel of the Doge in his role as head of state. It had no official public role, either in any kind of parochial sense or in any monastic sense. Nothing, I think, reflects the sort of symbiotic relationship between the Doge and San Marco than the direct physical connection between the two structures. The southern wing on the Molo contained the earlier Maggior Consiglio, probably embodying very little defensive consideration in its design, as many reconstructions have shown, or attempted to show. But again, the location of that wing on the bacino is again imbued with symbolism. It's at the farthest end of the Palazzo from San Marco, representing the other pole of power, if you like, practical and political power, rather than spiritual strength. Here met the great council that governed the Republic. The bacino outside, which it overlooked, represented, if you like, the tamed Venetian version of the great seas beyond, on which, of course, the Republic's livelihood and survival depended. It formed a sort of aquatic parade ground for marshalling the fleets, and it was a safe anchorage, of course, as well for the merchant marine. The Great Hall, raised high on its colonnade, commanded notable views over this most historic body of water. Again, of course, as did its successor after 1340. And finally, then, we had the Palace of Justice, facing the Piazzetta, down at the bottom here, on which the victims of Venetian justice, always fairly condemned, of course, could be publicly displayed from the scaffold or strung up between Ziani's columns outside. Physically, the Palace of Justice formed a very important link between the Maggior Consiglio on the right, the Palace of Wise Government, and the Church of San Marco, the spiritual shrine, on the other. Having now then established the basic elements of the pre-Gothic palace, of the Ziani palace, if you like, we now go forward to 1340 and the decision to rebuild, starting with the Molo wing. There is no evidence to suggest that this was at the time intended to be the start of a complete reconstruction, phase one, if you like. Rather, the underlying reason was simply that the Maggior Consiglio hall was far too small. The numbers of nobles had increased considerably. Even after the famous Serrata of 1297, the numbers eligible to vote continued to rise until the early 1300s. And it was this realization that even with some further controls, they simply couldn't be got in any longer, that the Molo wing was reconstructed. A record of 1301, in fact, says quite clearly that non est sufficiens illa dicta sala amplietur usque supercuriam. So practical necessity, really, began this long, complex process. And so it was rebuilt after 1340. The precise date of its completion seems still to be a little obscure, and I suspect it actually took place in stages over a long period of time. The great central window was one of the last elements in 1400. The contract with Delle Mazzenie for that window has survived, and like most such contracts, it was drawn up on an individual basis without any reference at all, really, to the context in which it was to be built. It seems, in a sense, to have been something of an afterthought, a rather late attempt to add some emphasis to what would otherwise have been, in fact, a very neutral facade without any kind of focal point. It is, as I'm sure you know, the only centralizing feature on the whole of the Molo elevation. Its symbolic function, even its triumphal function, I think can be easily appreciated today. And the Molo wing was finally occupied by the Maggior Concilio for the first time as late as 1419. Although it is said, at least by Sansovino, that the characteristic sheathing of the little pink and white tiles, according to Sansovino, were not added until the reign of Doge Foscari, which means as late as 1423 or even later. When complete, therefore, in the 1420s, rather fuzzy slide there, I'm afraid, the new wing formed a freestanding structure with its gable end projecting out into the piazzetta, rather in the manner of this reconstruction here, and with a completely arbitrary relationship, of course, with the old Ziani Palace of Justice between it and San Marco. The Palace of Justice was not to last for very much longer, however. In March 1424, its demolition was begun, apparently because of its alarming structural condition. It was already a couple of hundred years old, and so the basic design of the Molo wing was continued up the side of the piazzetta. The two facades together obviously produced a very much more impressive mass, a much more substantial structure than the single wing, a much greater presence. This decision, of course, to continue in the same manner was entirely consistent and proceeded to its conclusion by about 1438. An interesting point about this facade, though, is that it's one bay longer than the facade to the Molo. Now, the reasons for this are impossible to establish, but it produced a great difficulty to the next stage of this reconstruction process. To emphasize the continuity of function of this wing, a prominent figure of justice was placed in one of the roundels on the facade, announcing to the world the sage and rightful decisions that were to be continued to be reached within the palace, within the new wing. In 1438, Bartolomeo Bon was commissioned to design and carve the Porta Delicata, the new ceremonial entrance to the Palazzo. The Porta Delicata poses considerable problems, I think, not so much in its rich iconography and its ceremonial functions, which are in themselves are very clear, I think, but in its role in the development of the Palazzo as a whole. The two wings now complete, only now in 1438 was it decided to introduce a formal ceremonial entrance into the complex, a gateway, if you like, into the citadel of power. Because of the length of the piazzetta wing, then, the space in which poor Bon was left to work was actually extremely restricted. Very narrow, not much more than a slot between this monumental new wing and the southern corner of San Marco. To make his task even more difficult, of course, the new wing has a loggia, 2 stories of arcades, which meant that his porta had to be set back several meters from the general plane of the facade of that wing. So it's hardly an ideal brief then, in many ways, for a work that was to be so laden with symbolism. The question arises, and it certainly arose in my mind while I was drafting this paper, why was it introduced at all, or to put it another way around, why was a grandiose public entrance not introduced into the design of either of the two major wings from a much earlier stage in its construction. Neither of the wings, apart from the large central window at the upper levels, has any formal grandiose place of access at all. They simply consist of two continuous regular colonnades. The answer I would suggest, and it is only a suggestion, and I'd be very grateful for comments on this, might be sought in the way that the Republic regarded this bastion of power, its own self-image, if you like. The Republic, of course, loved ceremonial, as Deborah has shown in many ways. The endless visual recreations, for example, of the almost legendary meeting of Pope Alexander and Emperor Barbarossa clearly attest to this. But the proper place, of course, again, as Deborah has shown, for most of these great ceremonies was outdoors, not within the Palazzo Ducale. Yes, that's it, thank you. The Sposalizia on Ascension Day, the various andate that we've talked about of the Serene Prince to the churches and monasteries of the city. Later on, the pageantry of the Redentore and the Salute. All of these festae, of course, as we've seen, took place out of doors, formed a part of the life of the whole city and by extension of the entire Republic. The Molo itself, of course, with Ziani's columns, was the Republic's landing stage or gateway into the city. And the Piazza and Piazzetta, again, of course, as we've seen, the home for countless ceremonies and pageants. The Palazzo Ducale, though, was different. It still bore some vestigial echoes of its ancient semi-fortified origins, and of course it contained all of the supreme organs of state, all of them administered by an elite, closed oligarchy, finite, self-contained, self-circumscribed. They had no need or desire, in a sense, to open their doors and reach out towards the minuto popolo. This perception was to change later, but we might regard the serata as an attempt to, in itself, as an attempt to define the patriciate as being reflected physically, and to some extent, in the same closed, finite form of the structure of these two wings of the palazzo. So the Porta Delicata, therefore, I think can be conceived as an afterthought, a rather belated acknowledgement that this hub of power should have some kind of formal ceremonial approach through which ambassadors could be received and cardinals dismissed. A belated realization as well, of course, that such a gesture could only enhance the prestige of the Republic, particularly since it offered wonderful opportunities for the expression of symbolism and iconography at the highest level. Bartolomeo Bon took up this challenge with great skill and enthusiasm, as we can see, and produced a tour de force of sculptural masonry, the last really great work of florid Gothic in the city. Its location is as important symbolically as its iconography, to which I will turn in a moment. Squashed between the National Shrine and the Palace of Justice, and the equation of Venice, this equation of Venice as justice, Venice justice, the same thing, is the most potent aspect of its iconography. More than just the ceremonial entrance into the palazzo, it represents another triumphal arch, the entrance to the seat of justice, the Republic of Justice, under the direct protection of the evangelist, whose shrine flanked it on one side. A bridge, therefore, if you like, a bridge between terrestrial justice on the right and divine justice on the left. The iconography of the Porta reads as a programme, as has now been fairly well established, reading from the bottom up towards the top. The scheme, the iconography, the scheme of it is in fact already introduced to us by the judgment of Solomon on the adjacent corner of the Palazzo and the Justice Capitol immediately below it. So we already have this foretaste of the importance of the Porta with Moses, Aristotle, and Trajan, the lawgivers. In the niches flanking the Porta, we have the cardinal virtues: prudence, temperance, fortitude. In this case, joined by charity, because justice herself has been translated, if you like, up to the very pinnacle of the whole composition. And the other chief elements in the iconography are San Marco himself, and here he takes two different manifestations in his symbolic form as the winged lion, icon of the Republic. He is seen, of course, with Doge Foscari. Above the central window, I'm sorry, I seem to have lost the other one. Above the great central window we find him again, but here he is in human form as the evangelist, the link between God and man, again emphasizing the bridging effect of the structure between the shrine and the Palace of Justice. Finally, at the very top, there is Justice herself with sword and scales, seated incidentally on 2 more lions. There are a couple more symbolic aspects of the location of the Porta, which I think can perhaps be seen from the air. Both of them are vital as we come on to consider this slow development of the ceremonial axis. One is its relationship with the campanile, which stands directly in front and is, of course, as we've seen, itself laden with symbolism, the sentinel of the city, if you like, the bells of which setting the pace of the city's life, from the marangona, which defined the working day, to the tortiera, which summoned the nobles into the Magical Concilio to vote. Sansovino, as we've seen, drew the campanile into his great programme of works of reordering the piazza. Of more significance, I think, though, for the moment, is the relationship between the Porta and the palace beyond. It gives access, of course, into the northern end of the great central cortile. More specifically, it lay directly on the axis of the part of the east wing that contained the ducal apartments, as we saw on the plan earlier on. It was this fact, above all, that led to the development of this ceremonial axis, and immediately afterwards to the construction of first the Foscari colonnade, the arch, and eventually to the Scala dei Giganti. The Porta Delicata was completed in the early 1440s. The loggia seems to have grown directly from it, both in time and in its construction. We don't know very much at all about the details of the construction of the loggia, although Bon was considerably involved in it. There's no clear structural distinction between them, although stylistically we see a change as we progress towards the Foscari arch. The Renaissance becomes more and more apparent in the detailing of the structure. But the importance of the loggia behind the Porta Delicata is that it transformed what was initially simply an event, a triumphal arch, into a spatial sequence, a clearly defined axis, the extension of the arch into the very heart of the Palazzo. Its termination at the other end is, of course, the Foscari arch itself. A wedding cake, I think, is perhaps one way of describing it, an extraordinary construction, all of the glories of which are completely invisible to anyone entering the Palazzo from outside. It's a sort of a private indulgence in a way, best seen to full advantage either from the southern corner of the cortile or from the privileged location of the first floor loggia. It's a private tour de force, therefore, appreciated only by the cognoscenti. Arguably, also, one might consider it an appropriate epitaph for the almost interminable reign of Doge Foscari, who reigned for well over 30 years, although, in fact, it took so long to complete that even Foscari died by the time it was completed by Rizzo, probably in the later 1460s. It seems probable that the brief but, I think, significant reign of Pasquale Malipiero, 1457 to 62, may have given a boost to the later stages of the arch. Malipiero was a pretty enthusiastic promulgator of the image of Venice as the new Rome. My distinguished colleague Ennio Concina has drawn our attention to the many references to this image by Malipiero's contemporaries. Of his new Roman credentials, there seems very little doubt. The tenor of his own reign, I think, is very well illustrated by a brief detour to the eastern end of the city, to the arsenal, where the Landgate was constructed in 1458, a very spirited version of the classical Roman triumphal arch at Pola in Istria, just across the Gulf, one of Venice's territories. And I think a very good example of the literal way in which the new Rome image was taken up in Malipiero's reign. In this period, therefore, the importance of ceremonial was irrevocably linked with this active promulgation of the new Rome image. And it may have been the case that the possibility of a new, more suitable termination to the Palazzo Ducale axis was already under discussion in this period. However, this by now strong and notable axis into the palace had no significant termination at the far end. The vista so far was completed by the remaining Ziani wing of the ancient palace going back to the 1170s, the last remnants surviving. We know little of this structure, although it may well have had a staircase of some kind going up to the ducal apartments and the first floor. There was also at this time, interesting to note I think, an external stair next to the Foscari loggia here on the left-hand side, which rose alongside the loggia again to give access to the first floor. An interesting thing to remember, I think, since it must have made the Foscari loggia extremely dark, even darker than it is at the moment, which it certainly is. So 2/3 of the Palazzo had by now been rebuilt over a long period of about more than a century. The only surviving remnant was the eastern wing on the Rio di Palazzo. The next stage of the reconstruction, the final stage if you like though, was not the result of a conscious decision by the Signoria, it was an act of God. On the 14th of September 1483, a fire destroyed much of this surviving east wing, therefore provoking from necessity this final stage of reconstruction. Antonio Rizzo was appointed to supervise the reconstruction works, which were eventually to result in the vast monumental new wing, the fabric of which, if not the interiors, of course, we still see today. The work was completed by Pietro Lombardo after Rizzo's fall from grace and disappearance, shall we say, in 1498. Soon after work had begun on the east wing, the Maggior Concilio in 1485 made a very significant decision to incorporate some new elements into the ritual of the investiture of a new Doge. And it was this decision that led directly to the construction of Rizzo's staircase, which therefore did not form part of the very first designs of the east wing. This is a drawing by Bellini, which is believed to have perhaps influenced the design of the Scala dei Giganti. The decision was made on 11th of November 1485. The Maggior Concilio explained what they were doing in this way. This is a translation of their decision. The principal insignia of our most serene Doge is the ducal hat. Therefore, to give it form, he should receive it publicly and solemnly, rather than in a hidden manner from the hands of private persons, as was done up to now without any other ceremony. It was proposed that when the future prince and his successors will be elected, and they accept the banner of San Marco at the altar, and the Doge will be brought through the piazza and into the palace. He will ascend stairs for the acceptance of the oath of fealty, and then, immediately after the aforesaid swearing, the veil will be placed on his head by the junior councillor, and the ducal hat will be placed by the senior councillor, saying these words, Accipe coronam ducatus Venetiarum. In the same year, there is a manuscript, from the same year, there is a manuscript in the Correa, 1485, the year of Marco Barbarigo's coronation, and it states that the Doge was conducted into the Palazzo Ducale, and the decree of his election was read out on top of the stairs, where his promissione was accepted by the councillors and the capi della quarantia. In other words, the recommendations of the Maggior Concilio were put into almost immediate effect, only about a week later, on the 19th of November. Since work had certainly not yet begun on this new staircase, obviously preliminary sketches had probably hardly even been started, it seems highly likely that this stair used to take account of this new procedure was that at the southern end of the cortile, which has been long lost, and which gave access to the hall of the Maggior Concilio. Doge Barbarigo, though, reigned only for a few months before he died, and he was succeeded by his brother Agustin. Clearly, again, in these few months, there had still not been time to construct the new Rizzo staircase, which was in fact built during the reign of Agustin, who moved into the new apartments designed by Rizzo in 1492. I shall now, I think, quote at some length, not too excessive length, from Sanudo's Cronachetta, who again was on the spot and, as we know, kept the most extraordinarily detailed records of just about everything that went on in the Palazzo Ducale for 2 or 3 decades. I think it's worth citing his own words here. it doesn't. It doesn't. Oh dear. Oh dear. I think perhaps shall I continue? It's a bit of a shame because I would like to illustrate what I'm saying with a sequence of slides at this point, but I shall make a start. Sanudo said, then, with the Quarantuno having elected the Doge, the Signoria are informed. Ah, that's fine, thank you. Yes, yeah, hold it. Yep. Can you go back? That's it. Yes, thank you. The Signoria are informed, and they accompany the Doge into the Palazzo. And they leave there, and the bells are rung out all over the city of Venice, and fuochi, which one might translate as either fires or fireworks, are lit for 3 consecutive nights, and in all the lands and places in Venetian territory. And the whole world, he said, is given the news, in writing, of his election. And then in the morning, he is accompanied by the said 41, who elected him, into the church of San Marco. And they stand in the pulpit, not all 41 of them presumably, but at least a selected handful, although the pulpit is quite large, where the oldest of the 41 announces to the people that the new Doge has been elected, and there is much rejoicing, etc. Then the Doge speaks certain words, promising to dispense justice disinterestedly, to keep the Republic at peace and the land in abundance. Then, having heard Mass, they go to the altar of San Marco, where he promises to observe the conditions of his capitolare, his promissione, if you like, and the ducal ring is placed on his finger. Then he is taken out on a platform, carried by marinari, all around the piazza, and next to him is one of his closest younger relatives, and he holds a bowl full of money in front of him. The Doge scatters all around him ducats and coinage, some of which had been cast in the previous night in the mint, with his own name on it, and there are in the piazza an infinite number of people. Then he is taken, still scattering money, into the Palazzo, where the Signoria and the Quarantuna are waiting for him. Here he goes. And on the top of the stone staircase, the youngest of the 41 councillors gives him the veil for his head, and the oldest gives him the ducal berretta, which is of great value. It is kept in the jewel house in San Marco, covered with jewels and made of crimson velvet. And he speaks these words, which we heard just now, Accipe coronam ducatus Venetiarum, and then he is taken into the Sala del Piovego, and here he sits down with the berretta on his head, with the Signoria, and he throws yet more money to the people who are there. He then goes into his palazzo, the others leave, and his coronation is completed. Thus Sanudo in 1493. At about the same time as Sanudo, Canon Cazzola reported that a new flight of steps was being built, a stupendous and costly work, although it seems that at the time work had been temporarily halted for shortage of funds. Nevertheless, in 1494, Cazzola saw the Doge, quote, standing at the head of the stairs, and he then went into the palace to his own apartments. Shortly afterwards, interestingly, a general audit was begun on the spiralling costs of the whole of this east wing, expenditure on which so far had apparently reached 80,000 ducats. And in 1498, as a result of the inquiry's findings, Rizzo's embezzlement of funds was uncovered. Shortly afterwards, he fled to Foligno, and as we know, he never returned. The new staircase was almost certainly in use for the coronation of Doge Leonardo Loredan in 1501, and it was most certainly in use 20 years later when it came to the time of Antonio Grimani. Its construction, therefore, must be seen on two levels, as the furtherance of the development of this ceremonial axis and as the physical embodiment in stone of a vital aspect of this process of the election of a new serene prince. Architecture, therefore, in the most direct service of pageant, ritual and ceremonial. Terminating the axis of the Porta Delicata, loggia and arch, it provides the culminating link between the outside world and the home of the head of state, embodiment of the Republic. Its iconography, too, is essentially imperial. Not terribly easy to see, but victories in the spandrel panels, the Barbarigo arms, shields, helmets, various other classical Roman symbols of military triumph. The Scala rises directly to the level of the first floor loggia and thus finally brings in the third dimension, that of height, into what so far has been a purely level spatial progression. This element of height, of course, really was essential for this ceremonial function to give it grandeur. Equally clearly, height symbolized power and the status of the new heir to the throne of San Marco. It's worth mentioning now that I haven't so far referred to it as the Scala dei Giganti, for the very good reason that the giants were not yet there. Oh, there's a detail of some of the classical carvings on. All of these works to date had taken place in individual stages over a very long period of time, and in really an essentially fairly organic manner. Even the building of Rizzo's staircase took place, in a sense, as the result of the fortuitous loss of the east wing, and was added to the design of the whole wing for this specific reason. But the last great works in the piazza, beyond the Porta, represent an entirely different approach, the desire for the imposition of order, rationalization, harmony, controlling the spaces, the whole complex of the piazza and its immediate environs. As we know, nearly all of these works were executed by one man, Sansovino, in whom we see the strongest desire since Ziani, instructed of course by the Signoria, to impose as much order as was possible in this essentially organic collection of urban elements. His reordering of the piazza and piazzetta is of profound importance, although within the Palazzo Ducale, my own remit, his opportunities were really a good deal more limited. The first of two significant works took place just outside the Porta, but was immediately intimately connected to it, and that was the construction of the Loggetta, which of course itself forms a part of the general reordering of the piazza and the establishment of the campanile as a freestanding element. The key relationship here, though, is the relationship between the Loggetta and the Porta Delicata. Let's go to the next one, I think. That's a plan of the particular group. Sansovino completed this axis by placing the Loggetta across the base of the campanile so that it terminates the axis at the western end, constructed after 1537 at about the same time as the Marciana was begun. The practical function of the Loggetta has always been fairly modest. It notionally served as a meeting place for the nobility, and perhaps a bit more significantly was for a time used as a base for the guards, the arsenalotti who formed the Doge's personal bodyguard. For the first time, though, Sansovino's Loggetta acknowledges the importance of this ceremonial axis in the other direction, that is, outwards, down the Scala, across under the loggia and out into the piazza. A very difficult spatial experience to capture successfully in pictures, as I've discovered. The progression itself is rendered highly dramatic by virtue of this transition from a long, cool, dark loggia out into the brightness of the square. And the Loggetta itself, again, as we saw a little earlier, a fairly overt form of triumphal arch, very richly decorated. Sansovino's second intervention, though, takes us back inside, and that was to the other end of the axis, to Rizzo's staircase, already in use for some time as the platform for this pageant of the ducal coronation. The stairs were perhaps now seen as lacking a certain grandeur, and they were certainly by now rather dwarfed by the vast gleaming mass of the east wing that rose behind them. And so Sansovino added his two figures, the so-called giants, which were put in place in 1566. His son explains their significance, which is reasonably clear. As he says, one is the figure of Mars, representing the Venetian Empire da Terraferma. And the other one, Neptune, clearly enough, represents the Empire da Mar. The giants add very considerably to the presence and dignity of the Scala, and as Francesco noted in his own words, they apportano maestà e grandezza alla Scala. So with the final addition of the giants, Sansovino completed this axis, which had been begun by Bonn well over a century earlier. I'd like to conclude with one or two observations on, or summary notes if you like, on this matter of ritual and ceremony and how it related to the realities of the Doge's function. With Sansovino's interventions, of course, there is a clear overt desire to reorder, to formalise, to enhance the dignity of the piazza as the heart of empire. Naturally enough, all of this is a product of the philosophies of the time, of what we might yet again, for the sake of dreadful simplicity, refer to as the notorious myth of Venice as the new Rome. But there is another side to this coin, if you like, the harder facts of realpolitik, developing perceptions of the power, of the function and power of imagery of ceremonial and pageant, went in practice hand in hand with the gradual diminution of the real power of the Doge and his slow transformation into, if you like, into myth, into figurehead, as an almost unreal figure, a head of state of almost in an almost pontifical sense. Nevertheless, I think we can draw one or two suggestive parallels between the seat of San Pietro in Rome and the shrine of San Marco in Venice. One, the home of the fisher of men; the other, the interpreter of St. Peter, who, according to some beliefs, in fact wrote his own gospel from words dictated by Peter. The two are very closely linked, therefore, in the symbolism of the church, although, again, in real political terms, the two shrines often found themselves in conflict at one level or another. Nevertheless, these papal and Roman connections abound, particularly in ducal ceremonial. Nowhere are they more clearly exhibited than in the andati that we've talked about before, these ritual processions. A lot of these processions were accompanied, I think significantly here, by a series of emblems, among them 8 standards of silk, 6 silver trumpets, a white wax candle carried by a cleric dressed in purple and pink, symbolising in fact the absent pontiff, and an umbrella, which, like these other symbols, is said to have originated in the famous visit of Alexander III to the city in 1177. It is a bit ironic, therefore, that the more consciously and comprehensively this and many other aspects of Roman symbolism were lovingly cultivated by the Republic, the more slowly the Doge himself came to form more a part of the myth of the Republic rather than its real political power, much of which became vested in the Council of Ten and the Senate. Nevertheless, his image remained an extraordinarily powerful one. Here he is in the piazza scattering his money. An extraordinarily powerful one all over Europe, and there is no doubt that when he stood on the steps of the Scala dei Giganti, the news was of the greatest interest to all of the rulers of Europe, from London to Naples. He may have been addressed, according to strict protocol of the time, simply as Messer, but to the Venetian aristocracy and to the rulers of Europe, he was indeed the most serene prince. Thank you.
Right. Well, we're now going to have our respondent to that session, Dr. Dennis Cosgrove. Dr. Cosgrove is redoing cultural photography at University of Leicester, and he has published some studies on Venetian open space and on cartography, and he's editor of Social Formation and Symbolic Landscape, and he's author of the Palladian Landscape, Environmental Change and Cultural Representation in Renaissance Italy. So we're very pleased to have here Dr. Dennis Cosgrove.
Thank you. Am I on projector 1 or projector 2? Fine, thank you. Yeah, I see. That one. Richard Goy has given us, I think, a fascinating account of the slow, organic evolution of architecture and ceremonial in the Palazzo Ducale. a key secular building at the political and geographical heart of the Venetian Republic. The gradual integration of its three architectural elements, four if the whole ensemble is including the Basilica of San Marco is taken, as in terms of state iconography and ceremonial it should be, each with a distinct function, into a single aesthetic and symbolic ensemble, may be regarded as a microcosm of the same process in the buildings and spaces of the Piazza and Piazzetta of San Marco as a whole, the slow evolution of architecture and meaning. His emphasis on the ceremonial entrance at the Porta Delicata and the axis leading through that arch, eventually from Sansovino's Loggia to the platform at the top of the Scala dei Giganti, serves to emphasize an important aspect of the theme of this conference, that the relationships between architectural iconography and ritual activity are mutually constitutive. Stage set and script reciprocally stimulating alteration and development in the production of meaning, always in the context of an evolving social and political order. Richard Goy's initial qualification that he discusses ceremony indirectly through architectural iconography is thus, I think, entirely appropriate. It's sensible too, given such a significant, complex and slowly developing feature within the urban fabric, to focus our attention on those elements that become, during the period of the most intense elaboration of Venetian state ceremonial, the mediating points between public and private space in the centre of power, and the location for the key secular ceremonies in the installation of the Doge. Exits and entrances are important in what is, after all, a form of public theatre, theme to which I shall return. I myself find Richard Goy's interpretations well-founded and convincing. My intention here is simply to note a number of broader points that arise from a reading of his paper, with the intention of opening up discussion about the cultural and historical context of Venetian ritual and the iconography of the townscape of the city. These comments that I want to make now are speculative rather than founded upon the detailed knowledge of the building complex and architectural history so well displayed in Richard Goy's paper. I'll concentrate on four broad themes. Firstly, the implication of the interpretation that we've just had and its concentration on the Porta Delicata and the stairway axis in possibly narrowing our understanding of the role of the Palazzo Ducale as a whole within Venetian ritual and ceremonial. Particularly in that, I want to follow up the dialectic that he suggested between openness and closure, which runs through his paper. Secondly, the extent to which the ceremonial aspects of the ducal palace were incorporative, that is, how far they spoke to the whole of the civic body of Venice, as opposed to signifying and reflecting exclusivity in and of the body politic, which is a point I think that Philip Tabor was raising. Undoubtedly, such incorporative aspects changed over time, simultaneously responding to and promoting shifting relations between governors and the governed. Always, of course, a relationship occluded in Venetian social and ceremonial structures. Thirdly, related to this question, is that of alternative, or one might even say oppositional meanings generated in the interpretation and use of this architectural ensemble, and specifically its place in carnival and burlesque as opposed to solemn state ritual. And finally, the place of nature in the meanings of the Palazzo Ducale and its associated ceremonial, both the use of natural symbols in its architectural iconography and the natural metaphor of the body, one upon which Richard Goy's essay frequently draws, but which is not explicitly developed in his discussion. Firstly, then, the broader ceremonial meanings of the Palazzo Ducale. I think Richard is correct in pointing to the triple function of the Doge's palace: official residence of the Venetian head of state, meeting place for the Great Council and the Senate, and palace of justice. The three powers whose separation in the constitution of that Enlightenment state, the United States Constitution, so central in that the plan of the federal capital of Washington, D.C. was developed around their spatial separation and distinction, are here joined over time into a single architectural conception, initially, as has been shown under Ziani. Their external architectural unity was further emphasized by the rebuildings of the 14th and 15th centuries, as Richard Goy has shown. The tight closure of these three constitutional branches and the failure to plan any formal point of spatial transition between them and the city as a whole may be read as exclusive, closing off the elements of the state formation from the city. On the other hand, the building group is not separated from the urban fabric by large open spaces on all except one side. It is held firmly within the urban fabric, suggesting incorporation without the need for formal entrance or egress. As Goy points out, the private apartments of the Doge occupied the smallest and the least public part of the building, that closest to the basilica, private state church, that which gave sacred legitimacy to the constitution as a whole. It would, I think, be helpful to know how ceremonials attached to the non-executive elements of the state apparatus related to the building. Clearly, the iconography of justice is used decoratively to bring together executive and legislative branches, while that of the winged lions sanctifies their constitutional relationship. We know that the movement patterns traced out in ducal processions and andati sewed the private apartments of the basilica, and the basilica together via processional loops through the public open space of the piazza and the lagoon. Although this engraving of 1610, interestingly, doesn't use the Porta Delicata, but comes out against the lagoon. We know too that the ambassadors and foreign dignitaries used the piazzetta similarly. In each case, members of all three branches, of course, who were very often the same people in large measure, were involved. But were there processions or ceremonies which did not include the Doge? If so, do we know the patterns of ceremonial movement of Great Council and Senate members and of the judiciary in relation to the Palazzo? Did processions and ceremonies at fixed points define the meanings of these non-executive spaces within the Palazzo Ducale, linking internal and external architectural space? This is not to deny, of course, that the three elements are not in any way clearly differentiated within the Constitution. The courtyard of the Palazzo Ducale represented a very significant open area, cortile, enclosed within the architectural rectangle, but distinct from the axial line between campanile and private apartments. It is represented in a number of 16th century paintings as a place of miracles. How was it used in practice, and how did its use and meaning alter with the new emphasis on entrance and axiality in the later 15th and 16th centuries? The panoramic view over the Bacino di San Marco from the central window of the Sala del Maggior Consiglio is properly emphasized by Richard, but it relates neither to the ceremonial spaces of the piazza and piazzetta, nor to the monarchical role of the Doge as an individual. Given the narrow space before it, that's the narrow land surface space before and below it, in which a mass crowd might gather, it seems more as a place from which to view than at which to be seen, less individual perhaps than corporate in its ritual use. In sum, I wonder if the emphasis upon the person of the Doge within Venetian ceremonial, strong as it certainly was by the 16th century when, as Goy points out, his real power was diminishing, restricts our understanding of the ceremonial significance of the ducal palace within Venetian or constitutional identity insofar as it was aristocratic rather than monarchical. Second point is the incorporative aspects of the ducal palace ceremonial. John Ruskin once referred to the ducal palace as the Bible of the city, seeking to develop a moral interpretation of its iconography. I will resist the temptation to interpret Bartolomeo Bon's 1438 commission to design the Porta Delicata as support for Ruskin's selection of that same decade as the crucial turning point in the moral history of the city from a wisely governed republic to an arrogantly aristocratic oligarchy. But it is worth considering the extent to which the increasing elaboration of ceremonial events in the semi-private or at least exclusive spaces of the Palazzo reflected not merely the changing role of the Doge within the power structure of the state, but along with Andrea Gritti and Sansovino's Renovatio of the Piazza Piazzetta area, according to the style of imperial Romanità, a growing exclusivity and separation of social groups and their appropriate spaces within the city. Might we not read a similar shift in sensibilities in two representations of miracles performed by the body of St. Mark from some 75, 80 years apart in the 16th century, both painted for Scuole Grandi and both representing the ceremonial spaces of San Marco. We've already seen, and Deborah Howard has spoken about Gentile Bellini's stage set for the stage set of the piazza as a whole during a ceremonial procession of state, Corpus Domini. His painting integrates the corporate body of Venice, as Patricia Fortini-Brown's detailed analysis has shown. By contrast, Tintoretto's painting of the translation of the body of St. Mark also shows a miracle taking place in Venetian ceremonial space, but here it is the enclosed stage set of the interior courtyard of the Palazzo Ducale, occupied in the painting by men, and I emphasize it's men, of great gravitas, or by insubstantial creatures terrified away by the power of the performance. My question would thus concern to whom the iconography of the building and the ceremonies and rituals related to it spoke and were intended to speak. Did these change over time, and to what extent did the conversations between rulers and ruled, established through the building and its associated ceremonies, adopt an increasingly rhetorical character in the course of the 15th and 16th centuries? While I accept Deborah's point that both those who are performing and those who are observing the performance are engaged in a mutuality of observation, nevertheless, the rhetoric, I think, begins possibly to move more in one direction over time. Let me turn to my third point about Carnival, burlesque, and the Ducal Palace. Daniele Barbaro, in 1569, with characteristic attention to hierarchy, distinguished in his text on perspective between different types of theatre, in terms of the events taking place, the building appropriate to the performance, the social classes to whom they should be directed, and their appropriate location within the imagined city. Covered indoor theatres for the performance of drama, poetry, and music appeal to the intellect and have the highest rhetorical function. At the opposite end of the hierarchy are open-air amphitheatres for the vulgar enjoyment of public spectacle, gladiatorial display, and animal antics. An 18th century painting from the Quirini Stampaglia collection shows such vulgar activities taking place in the Piazzetta during Carnival. An acrobat flies down a wire from the Campanile to the palace colonnade. A balancing act frames the church of San Giorgio Maggiore, while pugilists square up against each other before the Marciana. These events are observed from the benches as we've seen before, erected along the line of the ceremonial axis that Richard Goy has discussed, and also from a balcony in the Palace of Justice. Occupants of the former were presumably of different status from those of the latter observation point, and different again from the standing crowd. Such events were not new in the 18th century. The world had been turned upside down in Venetian Carnevale for centuries. What were the contested and alternative meanings attributed to the Ducal Palace, its iconography and ritual at such times? We have some idea from Edward Muir's analysis of this. Even outside Carnival, it will be interesting to know how the spaces below the loggia of the palace were used. Again, I recall Ruskin's scandalized observation of 19th century Venetians using these spaces as a public urinal, and recollect that at least one homosexual was convicted in the 16th century for a relationship which included assignations in the same spot. puts a rather different frame of meaning on the dignity of the Palazzo Ducale to think of its use for such purposes. The place of nature, finally, in the meanings of the ensemble. My final set of questions might also begin with a reference to Ruskin's discussion of the palace. A strong thrust of his iconographic analysis was directed towards the capitals, sorry about the quality of this slide, along the lower colonnade. These certainly do offer enormous scope for interpretation, but they incorporate a degree of detailed representation of the natural world that might be surprising for such an intensely urban society and for a building whose functions were judicial and political. More importantly, we know that ritual and ceremony in most societies are naturalized by consistent reference to aspects of the physical world, as well, of course, as the metaphysical. The binding of land and sea in the Ascension Day marriage ceremony in the lagoon, discussed by Edward Muir, is an example. And the axis of the piazzetta leading from the merceria to the water's edge, linking land, the Stato da Terra and the Stato da Mar, framed by Ziani's column, joining land and water, fulfilled a similar function in concrete terms. In what ways did the architecture of the Palazzo Ducale and its changing decoration play a role in naturalizing the political and social meanings it articulated? One way of approaching this question might be to pursue very briefly the metaphor of the body. I've already introduced the concept of theatre in referring to entrances and exits and to Barbaro's hierarchy. Drama is articulated by bodily actions on stage. And a body, of course, is central to the entire political iconography of Venice. The basilica contains the uncorrupted body of St. Mark. That is its, and imaginatively the state's, entire raison d'etre. At the heart of the Palazzo Ducale resided the Doge, head of state, whose physical presence and bodily display in both life and death was becoming progressively the most important aspect of his role in Venetian life. The various elements making up the ceremonial building complex incorporated other parts of the body politic. Ritual and ceremonial, and indeed carnival and burlesque, united the corporate body of Venice in different ways, as the two paintings by Bellini and Tintoretto emphasize. The ultimate ritual use of the physical body to unite the social body in European culture is, of course, the Eucharist. It's perhaps not surprising, therefore, to find the Last Supper itself taking place in the courtyard of the Palazzo Ducale. We might be led to speculate on the consistent use of corporeal metaphors in writings on architecture also, especially in the Vitruvian discourse that Sansovino understood so well. I noticed that Philip Tabor referred to the transfiguration of social and political life, which of course is the ultimate decorporalization, if I can invent an awful word, of the body. To none of these questions have I ready answers, and I raise them not to imply any criticism of the invaluable contribution made by Richard's paper to our understanding of the iconography and ceremonial functions of the ducal palace. Indeed, it is only through detailed archival study of the kind that he has so successfully undertaken here and also in his 3 books that these questions can hope to be answered. I ask them solely to suggest that the range and depth of referencing in Venetian urban ritual is enormously rich, offering hugely rewarding possibilities for interpreting architecture and performance in terms of one another.
Right, well, we have a little period now when we can engage with the last 2 speakers. Have some contributions to this. Yes, Steve.
We've made several times that there's a paradox between the increasing importance of the Doge and its decreasing power. I suggest there's no paradox at all. The Doge was easily the single most powerful person in the government. And the absence of that paradox made this absolutely.
One on Dennis Parker's response. It strikes me that if one bears in mind the fact that the Doge's Palace was generally called the Palazzo Pubblico, another Doge's Palace, that this is an indication that the Venetians themselves were very conscious to try to neutralize the Doge's role within the palace and also within the iconography of the palace, even though, of course, with the changing passage of time and the weakening of the Doge as an actual effective monarchical figure, there is nonetheless a greater trade upon his presence both within the ceremony and on the outside of the building. The other point I had is a thought about Richard Goy's statement that the Porta Delicata was perhaps an afterthought. I doubt very much that it would have been an afterthought because there must have been an earlier entrance on that side, and if you accept the proposition that there was also an earlier staircase before the Scala dei Giganti, which seems perfectly plausible, and people have suggested, in fact, that Bellini's drawings reflect the earlier staircase, then probably this axial relationship is already there in some earlier form. One gets with the Foscari extension, and the Porta Delicata is a greater consciousness of trying to link San Marco and the Florid architecture and the sculptural program of San Marco with the rather functional, so to speak, state of the earlier Venice town.
Do you have any response to that?
Which is the question of the Palazzo Pubblico. I think it's worth bearing in mind that the Palazzo Ducale or Palazzo Pubblico contained an enormous range of government departments and offices and so on inside it. Some of them are fairly humdrum nature, not all of them, the majority of offices of the Republic. And also, particularly at ground floor level, I'm at least at some periods shortly after the Cosgrove was built. For example, the prison cells were housed in the lower wing on the ground floor, and the Piazza wing, at least on the east side, housed stables for horses. And I think stores and others they functioned on the outside. So at least at street level, for quite a long time, it seemed to have been accepted that fairly mundane, routine functions would take place. Only above, perhaps, did the more exhaustive activities begin to take place.
I think that is important, that we can become very quickly distracted from the daily use of this complex of buildings by, I suppose, the way we tend to see representations of it that apply to those times when it was used ceremonially. And so if we're thinking about meaning, it has a much broader one in that sense. So I concur with that. It's important for us to recall.
I want to make a much more visual observation about the loggia, which has always interested me very much. Unfortunately, you can't do this anymore because you're not allowed to walk up and down the stairs. But if you stand at the top of the stairs, the top of the Arco Foscari falls exactly at the first cornice of the loggia. So you just see the arches and the columns. Then if you stand on the second landing, you can see the attic, the whole loggia, not the whole width, but the whole height, but not the campanile. And you don't see the campanile until you come down. Now, obviously this depends on the height of the person, but the geometry of it is that because the distance between you and the top of the arch is much greater than the distance between the top of the arch and the loggia, I mean, even if one was 6'6", as opposed to my height, I don't actually think it would affect that relationship. The other thing is that as you all know, I mean, the loggia is actually 3 triumphal arches superimposed on one another, but the Arco Foscari narrows the view so that when you're on the staircase, you really just see a single triumphal arch. I mean, obviously it opens up as you go down. But I simply make this point to show that, you know, the minutest details of the ceremonial backdrop function were present in the mind of the... I mean, I can't believe it's chance. I'm sure that the architect thought very, very carefully about these visual consonances when he was designing it. Anyway, I can throw that out as an observation.
There is, of course, a painting in the collection of Birmingham University which shows the Loggia without the campanile. It then becomes, it looks very similar to, I think, and the point's no doubt been made by Baldic, just looking at this, to the design, I think, of Veronese's Feast of the House of Ligot, which is a theatre set again of a Last Supper.
Just about the denomination of Palazzo, I would like to underline that Palazzo Ducale is a unique palazzo from the point of view of all the sources, not only from the literary sources, but also from the decoration of revenue and possession gain. That's important.
The well in the Palazzo Ducale was, I think, supposed to have particularly good water. Is that right? I read it somewhere anyway. That the people, specifically, if they wanted a drink, thought the best water was from the well in the Palazzo Ducale, which confirms that, it was publico, really.
I was just going to say, you have to remember that because the Duke of Andati, there were only 12 in the 17th century, 14, that if you have one procession every 5 days, or you have a lot of processions, really only 12 of those include the Doge actually going down the Scala dei Giganti and out of the Porta Delicata. The rest of the time it is the Signoria without the Doge, so in fact that explains a lot of the usage. It wasn't only for the Doge, in fact most of the time it was for the Signoria without the Doge. That's right. There was only 12 or 14 Duke of Andati.
To what extent were there different rituals that they found, or different routes being taken when the Doge was or was not included?
Well, that I haven't worked out, but obviously the Doge stands on the top of the Scala dei Giganti from the crowd, and I think during Duke of Andati he always comes down the Scala dei Giganti. Also, well, it depends. Often he would go down to San Marco, but he would go halfway through the Arco Foscari and go in fact to San Marco through a door that is in the Arco Foscari. He wouldn't go, if you said, normally he would not go out of the Porta Delicata and around to the front door of San Marco, because the Ducal Palace, San Marco was in fact the Ducal Chapel. He didn't need to go outside to get in. I mean, he just went through his own door. In fact, he could stand in two different places. One is the Scala dei Giganti, go through his own door, the Porta Media, into San Marco. Or he could, in fact, go through a window that, in fact, looked into the church. So he could, in fact, hear mass without having to go to something. It's very complex. And I think there's a whole lot of different answers to which day it was. So.
Right, well, if there aren't any more questions, can I say